In the dark waters of the Pacific Ocean during World War II, a mystery unfolded that would haunt Japanese naval commanders for the rest of their lives. They had trained for years, perfected their weapons, and believed their torpedoes were the most deadly in the world. When they launched their attacks against American warships, they expected to see those massive steel vessels break apart and sink beneath the waves within minutes. But something impossible happened instead. The American ships took direct hits from torpedoes that should have torn them in half, yet they kept moving forward, kept firing their guns, and refused to die. Japanese admirals watched through their binoculars in complete disbelief as ships that should have been at the bottom of the ocean continued to fight back with terrible fury. This was not what their training had prepared them for. This was not what their experience told them was possible. These American warships seemed to possess some kind of supernatural power, some secret magic that allowed them to absorb punishment that would have destroyed any other navy's vessels. The shock and confusion this created in the minds of Japan's finest naval commanders would change the course of naval warfare forever and reveal a story of engineering genius, sacrifice, and determination that few people truly understand even today. The Imperial Japanese Navy entered World War II with supreme confidence in their weapons and tactics. For decades, they had studied the art of naval warfare and had developed what they believed were the finest torpedoes ever created by human hands. Their Type 93 torpedo, which they called the Long Lance, was a technological marvel that traveled faster, hit harder, and reached farther than any torpedo used by other nations. Japanese naval officers had spent countless hours training their crews to launch these weapons with perfect precision, and they had every reason to believe that when their torpedoes struck an enemy ship, that ship would quickly sink beneath the waves. The Japanese Navy had also studied American shipbuilding and had intelligence reports about the types of vessels the United States was constructing. They knew the Americans were building large battleships and aircraft carriers, but they believed their superior training and superior weapons would overcome any advantage the Americans might have in numbers or size. The Japanese admirals had fought against the Russian Navy decades earlier and had won a stunning victory that made them legends throughout Asia. They had seen Russian warships explode and sink after being hit by Japanese torpedoes and shells, and they expected the same thing would happen when they faced the American fleet in battle. When the war began with the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Japanese pilots and submariners launched their torpedoes against the American battleships anchored in the harbor. Many of these ships were indeed damaged or sunk, but even in that first battle, Japanese commanders noticed something unusual. Some of the American ships took multiple torpedo hits yet remained afloat for hours, giving their crews precious time to fight fires and evacuate wounded sailors. The Japanese had expected these massive battleships to capsize and sink within minutes after being struck by their powerful Long Lance torpedoes, but instead, many of them settled slowly onto the harbor bottom in shallow water, where they could potentially be raised and repaired. This was the first hint that American ships possessed some quality that made them harder to kill than expected. In the months that followed, as naval battles erupted across the vast Pacific Ocean, Japanese submarine commanders and surface ship captains repeatedly reported the same puzzling phenomenon. They would strike an American cruiser or destroyer with torpedoes that should have been fatal, yet the ship would continue sailing, sometimes even increasing speed to escape further attacks. American aircraft carriers took bomb hits that penetrated their flight decks, yet these floating airports continued launching planes to strike back at Japanese forces. What the Japanese admirals did not fully understand was that American naval engineers had spent years developing something called damage control systems that were far more advanced than anything Japan had created. When an American warship was built in the shipyards of Newport News, Brooklyn, or San Francisco, it was constructed with multiple watertight compartments separated by thick steel doors and walls. If a torpedo exploded against the hull and flooded one compartment, the sailors could seal off that section and prevent water from spreading throughout the entire ship. American vessels also had sophisticated pumping systems that could remove thousands of gallons of seawater every minute, allowing damage control teams to fight against flooding, even while their ship was under continued attack. The American Navy had learned lessons from World War I, and from studying how British ships had survived damage during battles in the Atlantic. They had taken those lessons and created training programs that taught every sailor on every ship how to fight fires, patch holes, shore up weakened bulkheads, and keep their vessel fighting even when it seemed impossible. Japanese ships, by contrast, were built with a different philosophy that emphasized speed and offensive power over defensive survival. Japanese naval architects believed that the best defense was a strong attack, so they designed ships that could move quickly and hit hard but were not as well protected against damage. In May 1942, the Battle of the Coral Sea became the first naval battle in history where the opposing fleets never saw each other directly, because all the fighting was done by aircraft launched from carriers. During this battle, Japanese planes found the American aircraft carrier Lexington and struck it with multiple torpedoes and bombs. The Japanese pilots flew back to their own carriers and reported that they had definitely sunk the Lexington and possibly damaged the Yorktown as well. Japanese Admiral Takeo Takagi was confident that he had won a great victory and had removed 2 American carriers from the war. But then, hours later, reconnaissance planes brought back shocking news. The Lexington was still afloat and was still launching aircraft. Even more surprising, the carrier was moving under its own power and seemed to be escaping from the battle area. The Japanese could not understand how a ship that had taken so much damage could possibly still be operational. What they did not know was that, inside the Lexington, hundreds of sailors were fighting desperately to save their ship, using every damage control technique they had learned during countless training drills. They were pumping out water, putting out fires, and repairing damaged systems even while Japanese planes circled overhead looking for another chance to attack. The aircraft carrier Yorktown became a legend among both American and Japanese sailors because of its incredible ability to survive damage that should have sent it to the bottom of the ocean. During the Battle of the Coral Sea, the Yorktown took a bomb hit that penetrated deep into the ship and caused serious damage. Japanese intelligence officers marked the Yorktown as probably sunk or at least out of action for many months. But the American damage control crews worked around the clock, and within just a few weeks, the Yorktown was repaired enough to sail to the Battle of Midway in June 1942. At Midway, Japanese dive bombers found the Yorktown again and struck it with 3 bombs that started massive fires and caused the ship to lose power. Once again, Japanese pilots reported that the carrier was finished and would certainly sink. But the American damage control teams fought the fires, restored power to some systems, and actually got the ship moving again at a slow speed. When Japanese planes returned later that same day, they could not believe they were seeing the same carrier they had bombed earlier because it looked like it was operating normally. They thought it must be a different American carrier and attacked it again, this time with torpedoes. The Yorktown finally did sink, but only after taking an incredible amount of punishment over several days and giving its crew multiple chances to save themselves. American cruisers became particularly famous for their ability to absorb torpedo damage and continue fighting, which baffled Japanese submariners who stalked them through the Pacific waters. The heavy cruiser Minneapolis was sailing near Guadalcanal when a Japanese submarine fired torpedoes that struck the ship near the bow. The explosion was so powerful that it completely blew off the front part of the ship, removing about 75 feet of the cruiser's bow section. Any normal ship would have immediately flooded and sunk nose first into the ocean. But the crew of the Minneapolis sealed off the damaged section, and the ship actually sailed backward for several miles until it could be turned around safely. The cruiser then sailed all the way to a repair base with no bow at all, looking like a strange floating rectangle instead of a proper warship. Japanese observers who saw this damaged cruiser limping away could not believe their eyes because they had never seen a ship survive such catastrophic damage. Similar stories happened with other American cruisers like the New Orleans, which also lost its bow to a torpedo, and the San Francisco, which took over 40 shell hits during a night battle but remained in action throughout the entire fight. American destroyers were smaller and more lightly built than cruisers or battleships, yet they too demonstrated an amazing ability to survive damage that should have sunk them quickly. These smaller warships often fought at close range against Japanese vessels, and they frequently took hits from shells, torpedoes, and bombs. The destroyer Laffey became legendary when it was attacked by 22 Japanese kamikaze planes in just 80 minutes during the Battle of Okinawa. The ship was hit by 6 kamikaze aircraft and 4 bombs, and its decks were covered with fire and wreckage. Japanese commanders who saw the battle assumed the Laffey had been completely destroyed. But the crew kept fighting, kept pumping water, kept putting out fires, and the destroyer survived. It was towed to safety and eventually repaired to fight again. The destroyer Johnston fought at the battle off Samar against an entire Japanese fleet that included battleships and cruisers, vessels many times larger and more powerful. The Johnston took hundreds of hits from Japanese shells and at least 1 torpedo, yet it kept firing its guns and launching torpedoes at the enemy for over 2 hours before it finally sank. Japanese sailors who watched the Johnston fight were so impressed by the courage and determination of its crew that Japanese officers actually saluted the sinking destroyer as it went down. The secret behind American ships' incredible survivability was not just good engineering, but also intensive training that turned every sailor into a damage control expert. From the moment a young man joined the Navy and arrived at boot camp, he began learning how to save a damaged ship. He learned how to use portable pumps to remove water from flooded compartments. He learned how to fight different types of fires using water, foam, or chemicals depending on what was burning. He learned how to shore up weakened bulkheads using wooden beams and metal braces so that damaged walls would not collapse and let water spread further through the ship. He learned how to patch holes in the hull using mattresses, blankets, wooden boards, and anything else that could stop water from pouring in. Most importantly, he learned to stay calm and keep working, even when explosions were shaking the ship and fires were burning all around him. American damage control training was so thorough that sailors could perform these complex tasks almost automatically, even in darkness, even in smoke-filled compartments, even when they were exhausted and terrified. This training made the difference between a ship that sank in minutes and a ship that stayed afloat for hours or days. Japanese naval officers became increasingly frustrated as the war continued, and they kept seeing American ships survive attacks that should have destroyed them. Admiral Madome Ugaki wrote in his personal diary about his confusion and anger when reconnaissance planes reported that American carriers his pilots had claimed to have sunk were still operating days or weeks later. Japanese submarine commanders complained that they were wasting precious torpedoes on American ships that simply would not die. Some Japanese officers began to believe that American ships were built with some kind of special steel or special armor that Japanese intelligence had not discovered. Others thought that perhaps the Americans had many more ships than Japanese intelligence had estimated, and what appeared to be the same ship surviving multiple attacks was actually several different ships that looked similar. The truth was simpler but harder for proud Japanese officers to accept. American ships were surviving because American sailors were better trained in damage control, and American naval architects had designed vessels with survivability as a key priority. The Japanese Navy had focused so much on creating ships that could attack effectively that they had neglected to make those ships good at surviving when they were hit. The naval battles around Guadalcanal Island in late 1942 and early 1943 became a crucial testing ground where Japanese admirals repeatedly witnessed American ships' incredible toughness. In a series of vicious night battles fought at close range in the narrow waters around the island, American and Japanese ships blasted each other with guns and torpedoes in chaotic fights that sometimes lasted only minutes. Japanese cruisers and destroyers scored many hits on American vessels, and they watched those ships catch fire and slow down. Japanese commanders assumed they had won victories and that the damaged American ships would sink. But when morning came and reconnaissance planes flew over the battle area, they found American ships still afloat, still moving, and in some cases still fighting. The pattern repeated itself battle after battle. Ships that should have been underwater were instead limping toward repair facilities, their damage control crews having performed miracles during the night to keep them floating. Meanwhile, Japanese ships that took similar damage often sank much more quickly because their crews had not been trained as thoroughly in damage control techniques, and because their ships lacked the sophisticated compartmentalization and pumping systems that American vessels possessed. American submarines also benefited from superior damage control, though their stories were less visible because submarines operated alone in distant waters. Japanese depth charges damaged many American submarines during the war, sometimes causing leaks, fires, or mechanical failures that would have doomed submarines from other navies. But American submarine crews were trained to handle emergencies, and their boats were built with redundant systems that could keep functioning even when primary systems were damaged. The submarine darter ran aground on a reef while attacking a Japanese fleet and should have been lost completely. But the crew evacuated safely, and American ships tried for days to destroy the stranded submarine to prevent Japanese forces from capturing it and learning American submarine secrets. The darter proved so tough that it resisted demolition charges and remained partially intact even after intense efforts to destroy it. American submarines also rescued many downed pilots and stranded sailors during the war, operations that required the submarines to surface in dangerous waters where they could be attacked. The boat's toughness and their crew's skill allowed them to take risks that submarines from other navies could not have survived. Aircraft carriers were the most important warships in the Pacific War, and the American carriers proved to be remarkably difficult to sink despite being large targets that carried thousands of gallons of aviation fuel and tons of bombs and torpedoes. Japanese pilots knew that if they could set fire to a carrier's fuel supplies or detonate its stored ammunition, the ship would be destroyed from within by massive explosions. They scored hits on many American carriers during the war and started fires that should have spread throughout the ships and caused fatal explosions. But American carriers had sophisticated fire suppression systems and damage control procedures specifically designed to prevent fires from reaching fuel storage areas and ammunition magazines. When a Japanese bomb or torpedo hit a carrier, damage control teams immediately began flooding magazines with water to prevent the ammunition from exploding. They fought fires with foam and sprinklers while other teams sealed off damaged sections and kept the rest of the ship operational. The carrier Franklin was hit by 2 bombs while operating near Japan in early 1945. The bombs caused fires that detonated stored ammunition and created explosions that killed hundreds of sailors. The ship was so badly damaged that Japanese pilots reported it had definitely sunk. But the Franklin stayed afloat, and its crew managed to restore enough power to sail the ship all the way across the Pacific Ocean to New York for repairs. A journey of thousands of miles in a vessel that looked like it had been through an earthquake. Behind every ship that refused to sink were sailors who made the conscious choice to stay and fight instead of abandoning their vessel and saving themselves. When a ship was hit by torpedoes or bombs, the natural human instinct was to get off that ship as quickly as possible before it sank and dragged everyone down with it. But American damage control training taught sailors that they had a good chance of saving their ship if they stayed calm and worked together. Officers led by example, staying in the most dangerous parts of damaged ships to coordinate repair efforts. Sailors volunteered to enter flooded compartments to close valves or seal doors, knowing they might drown if water rose too quickly. Men fought fires in ammunition storage areas, knowing that a single spark could trigger an explosion that would kill everyone nearby. The sailors who performed these acts of courage were not superhuman warriors, but ordinary young men, many of them teenagers serving on a ship for the first time in their lives. They found courage because they had been trained to know what to do in an emergency, because they trusted their officers and their fellow sailors, and because they believed their efforts could actually save the ship and save their friends. The fact that American ships were so hard to sink had enormous strategic consequences that affected the entire course of the Pacific War. Japan had fewer ships than the United States and could not replace losses as quickly as the Americans could build new vessels. Japanese war planners had assumed that their superior training and superior torpedoes would allow them to sink American ships at a fast enough rate to offset America's industrial advantage. But when American ships kept surviving attacks that should have destroyed them, the mathematics of the war shifted dramatically against Japan. A ship that survived meant Japan had wasted precious torpedoes and bombs without achieving results. A ship that survived meant American sailors lived to fight another day with experience that made them even more dangerous. A ship that survived could be repaired and sent back into battle, sometimes within weeks or months. The carrier Yorktown fought at Coral Sea, was repaired and fought at Midway, and even though it eventually sank, it had accomplished far more than Japanese planners had thought possible for a carrier that had been badly damaged. Every ship that refused to die frustrated Japanese plans and forced Japanese admirals to commit more resources to trying to sink vessels they thought they had already destroyed. As Japanese commanders realized that American ships were incredibly tough, they began changing their tactics to try to overcome this advantage. They developed the kamikaze suicide attack strategy in which pilots deliberately crashed their planes into American ships, reasoning that a plane that physically smashed into a vessel would cause more damage than a bomb dropped from altitude. The kamikaze attacks did cause terrible damage to many American ships and killed thousands of sailors. But even kamikaze attacks often failed to sink their targets because American damage control crews fought the fires and flooding caused by crashed planes. Ships like the carrier Enterprise, the battleship Maryland, and dozens of destroyers and destroyer escorts survived multiple kamikaze hits and remained in service. Japanese forces also tried using larger bombs and special torpedoes designed to break ships' backs by exploding underneath them rather than against their sides. Some of these weapons did cause severe damage, but American naval architects responded by improving ship designs and damage control systems with each new class of vessels that came out of the shipyards. While American ships were remarkably tough and hard to sink, this toughness came at a price measured in human suffering and sacrifice. Sailors who stayed aboard damaged ships to fight fires and flooding often died when their vessels finally did sink, or when secondary explosions occurred. Men working in engine rooms and damage control stations below the waterline had little chance to escape if their ship went down quickly. The Arizona exploded and sank in minutes at Pearl Harbor, trapping over 1,000 sailors inside. The Indianapolis sank rapidly after being torpedoed, and hundreds of sailors who survived the sinking died in the water over several days before rescue arrived. American toughness also meant that sailors sometimes had to endure hours or days of terror and exhaustion aboard ships that were slowly sinking or burning. The crew of the Franklin fought fires and explosions for an entire day while standing on decks that were covered with dead and wounded comrades. The survivors of damaged ships often suffered from burns, wounds, and psychological trauma that stayed with them for the rest of their lives. The toughness that kept ships afloat was created by the blood and sacrifice of thousands of young men who chose duty over safety. The lessons learned from American ship survival in World War II shaped how navies around the world designed and operated their vessels for decades afterward. Modern warships are built with extensive damage control systems, multiple redundant systems, and compartmentalization that follows principles developed during the Pacific War. Naval training programs worldwide now emphasize damage control as a core skill that every sailor must master regardless of their primary job on the ship. The United States Navy maintains teams of damage control experts who study historical battles and modern scenarios to continually improve techniques for saving damaged vessels. Some modern ships carry damage control equipment that seems crude and old-fashioned, like wooden boards and hammers and nails, because those simple tools proved effective during World War II and remain useful today. The idea that a ship's crew is just as important as the ship's weapons or armor is now a fundamental principle of naval warfare, and it came directly from the experiences of sailors who kept their vessels fighting during those desperate battles in the Pacific. After the war ended, many Japanese naval officers who survived came to respect and admire the damage control capabilities of their American opponents. In interviews and memoirs, they spoke about their shock and frustration when they encountered American ships that simply would not sink. Some Japanese officers visited American ships after the war and studied their damage control systems with professional interest, recognizing that they had been fighting against an enemy who had mastered an aspect of naval warfare that Japan had neglected. The famous Japanese Admiral Arleigh Burke, who commanded destroyers in several night battles, later worked alongside American officers and learned about their training methods. Japanese maritime self-defense forces that were created after the war adopted many American damage control practices and training methods. The mutual respect between former enemies grew from recognition that American sailors had been brave and skilled opponents who had earned their victories through superior preparation and determination. Among the most heroic but least recognized sailors on American ships were the men who worked in the engine rooms and fire rooms deep in the bowels of the vessels. These men could not see what was happening during battles because they were sealed inside compartments below the waterline where they operated the machinery that powered the ships. When torpedoes or bombs hit, men in the engine rooms often had no way to know how badly the ship was damaged or whether they needed to evacuate. They stayed at their posts keeping the engines running and the pumps working because they knew their shipmates above were counting on them to provide power. During damage control emergencies, engine room crews had to make quick decisions about redirecting steam, activating backup pumps, and managing electrical systems to support the men fighting fires and flooding. If a ship lost power, it became a helpless target that could not maneuver to avoid further attacks and could not operate pumps to remove water. Many engine room sailors died at their posts when ships sank, trapped below decks because they had chosen to keep the machinery running until the very last moment. Their names are less famous than pilots or admirals, but their contribution to keeping American ships fighting was absolutely essential. The story of American ships refusing to sink teaches lessons that go far beyond naval warfare and engineering. It demonstrates what human beings can accomplish when they are properly trained, properly led, and properly motivated to work together toward a common goal. The sailors who saved damaged ships were not performing individual acts of heroism, but were working as coordinated teams in which every person understood their role and trusted their teammates to do their jobs. This kind of teamwork under extreme pressure requires training, leadership, and a culture that values every person's contribution. Modern organizations of all kinds study these historical examples to understand how to build teams that can handle crises effectively. The damage control parties on World War II ships were essentially emergency response teams that had to diagnose problems quickly, implement solutions under terrible conditions, and adapt when their first approaches did not work. These are skills that matter in hospitals, in businesses, in communities facing natural disasters, and in any situation where people must work together to overcome challenges that seem overwhelming. When historians and naval experts analyzed the Pacific War after it ended, they calculated that American ships survived an average of significantly more torpedo and bomb hits than Japanese ships did before sinking. This survival advantage meant that Japan had to invest far more resources into trying to sink American vessels than American forces had to invest in sinking Japanese vessels. The disparity grew worse for Japan as the war continued because American shipyards were producing new vessels at an incredible rate, while Japanese shipyards struggled to replace losses. By the end of the war, the United States Navy was many times larger than when the war began, while the Japanese Navy had been reduced to a fraction of its original strength. American ships' toughness was not the only factor that determined the war's outcome, but it was a significant factor that Japanese planners had not anticipated. If American ships had sunk as quickly as Japanese admirals expected, the war might have lasted longer and cost even more lives. The stubborn refusal of American vessels to die when they were hit meant that Japan was fighting an enemy who could not be defeated through conventional naval warfare, an enemy whose ships seemed to have the will to survive no matter how much punishment they took. Today, many of those tough American warships rest on the ocean floor as artificial reefs and war graves, home to marine life and memories. The Arizona still lies in Pearl Harbor with over 900 sailors entombed inside, a reminder of the price of war and the sacrifice of those who served. The Yorktown, the Lexington, the Indianapolis, and hundreds of other vessels that fought so hard to stay afloat eventually succumbed to their wounds and slipped beneath the waves. But many others survived the war and were later scrapped or converted to other uses. Some, like the battleship Missouri and the carrier Midway, have been preserved as museums where visitors can walk the decks and imagine what it was like when those ships were young and fighting for survival. The men who served on these vessels are now in their 90s if they are still alive, and their numbers decrease every year. But their legacy lives in every modern warship that sails with sophisticated damage control systems, in every sailor who trains to save a damaged vessel, and in every person who learns that determination and teamwork can overcome obstacles that seem impossible to defeat. The story of American ships that took torpedoes and kept fighting is ultimately a story about the human spirit's refusal to surrender in the face of overwhelming odds. Japanese admirals were shocked not because of some magic or secret weapon, but because they encountered an enemy who had prepared more thoroughly, trained more intensively, and fought with a determination they had not expected. The American sailors who kept their ships afloat were not superhuman. They were scared young men far from home, facing weapons designed to kill them, working in darkness and smoke and chaos. But they did their jobs anyway. They pumped water, fought fires, patched holes, and refused to give up even when every logical calculation said their ship was doomed. They did this not just once but hundreds of times throughout the Pacific War, on big ships and small ships, in famous battles and forgotten skirmishes. Their collective effort created a phenomenon that baffled their enemies and changed naval warfare forever. When those Japanese admirals looked through their binoculars and saw American ships still fighting after taking hits that should have destroyed them, they were not just seeing better engineering or better training. They were seeing the power of human determination, the strength that comes from preparation and teamwork, and the incredible things that ordinary people can accomplish when they refuse to accept defeat. This is why the story matters, and why it deserves to be remembered long after the last veteran has sailed into the sunset, and the last warship has returned to the sea.